Um, but for tonight, I mentioned that I'm leaning on the work of a lot of people. I just kind of want to put this up front. These are some of the people that I really leaned into in putting together this presentation. So I encourage you to write it down, take a picture. I'll have this at the end as well. And you'll notice the resource here, The Case for Easter. That's actually the book on the back table, and you're welcome to take one of those. And that's a really great, concise resource. And Strobel references a lot of these guys too, so it can kind of even just be a stepping stone for you if you want to dig in deeper. So I'll have this slide again at the end. But just to kind of set the course for tonight, basic questions that we're asking is, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And what's the best explanation of the facts that seem to be established? Now, something that we have to kind of deal with at the outset is, are miracles possible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back to the coma.
Exactly. I know. Yeah. So some of us have firsthand experiences that convince us that miracles are possible. There's other people who believe that miracles are not possible. They believe that God doesn't exist. And so, by matter of fact, something like the resurrection just wouldn't be a possible explanation. It's not one that you could even entertain. And so it's important for us to kind of deal with this, I think, at the outset. One of the things that, if you dig into some of these debates that will come up, is the number of scholars that agree on certain facts or the other, and some who don't believe in the resurrection would say, well, most of the biblical scholars are Christians, as it turns out. Surprise, surprise. But the nature of the resurrection is that if you do believe that the evidence leads to suggesting that this actually occurred, then of course you would become a Christian. So it's kind of one of those unique sort of questions that if you answer yes, that's going to change everything for you. And if you say no, then it's going to radically change things as well. But some things just to understand about the nature of just scientific laws is that they're really statistical. They're telling us what has happened in the past, because that's all we can observe. We cannot observe the future. We can only observe the past. And so there are human conclusions on what has generally always happened. And on the basis of what has happened, we can try to predict what's going to happen in the future. And that's generally reliable. And so we can build things like cars and do all kinds of incredible things. But again, that's just looking at the past. It's not saying what's possible in the future. And the nature of miracles as such in making that claim is that they're anomalies. They're outside of the norm. That's what we mean when we say something miraculous happened. And so if you were to say that miracles don't happen because that's not what normally happens, well, that's missing the point. That's really kind of begging the question. That's exactly what's being claimed. And C.S. Lewis puts it, I think, even probably better than I just said it. He says, unfortunately, we know the experience against miracles to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. And so what I would like to kind of suggest kind of at the outset is that we should be open to the possibility of miracles, open to the possibility of God existing. If there's a God who exists, then he's the God that created this universe. There's no really any miracle greater than that. So if we think like resurrection's crazy, well, how about the whole rest of the universe coming into existence? And so if God just exists, then that kind of says, okay, well, this is possible. Now, that doesn't mean that even if God exists, that doesn't mean necessarily that the resurrection occurred. Just thinking logically here, philosophically here. There's lots of people who believe in God besides Christians, but God opens up the possibility for that to happen. So For instance, if we walked over into the cemetery over here, tomorrow morning, and one of the graves is dug out, the casket's open, and the body that was in it is no longer there. You could surmise, well, maybe this person rose from the dead, but that would be an improbable explanation. Probably the explanation we'd go to is that this person's body was stolen from the grave, because there isn't any circumstances that would lead us to believe that this person has been resurrected. But if you're a person who believes that God exists, then that could be a possibility, even if that's an improbable explanation. It's just that it's going to take us a while to arrive at that being the most likely explanation, rather than someone coming in with a shovel and just digging the person out. So as I've said, this all depends on the existence of God. And when we're talking about the existence of God, the existence of God can't be proven in a scientific laboratory. Like, okay, we did this acid test and God exists. But what you can do through the study of science and also through the study of history, looking at things like these resurrections claims, is that you can make inferences. You can build a case for the existence of God. And so it's kind of more along the lines of solving a crime, which is called using abductive reasoning. You collect a variety of the facts. It's like if you had a criminal case and they said, okay, the DNA comes back and, it's Bob's DNA. Well, okay, that says Bob was there, but you need other facts there to conclude that Bob committed any crime. Maybe Bob was just hanging out, and that's kind of what we're doing when it comes to the existence of God. When it comes to other Christian claims, you need to assemble all the facts in order to make your case. So just to kind of set the backdrop here for thinking about Jesus' resurrection, it's really important for us to look at the Old Testament and the expectations that they had regarding resurrection. Now, this picture here is not a picture of Jesus. You kind of expect it is a picture of Jesus, but it's not. This is a picture of the prophet Ezekiel, the vision that he had at the Valley of Dry Bones. And this is one of the instances in where you have resurrection anticipated. In Ezekiel 37:11 through 14, Ezekiel says, "Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are indeed cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will bring you into the land of Israel, and you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. And I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord." Interpreting this prophecy, you could say, okay, this is talking about the return of the Israelites from exile. But it's also suggesting something more, which is why the Jewish people, not all of them, there's certain sects that don't believe in a resurrection, but a large majority of the Jewish people came to believe in a future resurrection. You see this also prophesied in Daniel, where it says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." You go to the prophet Isaiah, he says, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise." And so by the time you get to Jesus, as I was saying, most people believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees, which is a certain religious sect within Judaism, were proponents of resurrection, whereas you had the Sadducees, they didn't believe in a resurrection. But the Pharisees would have leaned on texts like this in making their case for a future resurrection to come. But the thing that's important to note about this is that these prophecies are looking towards a resurrection of all people, not just one individual. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as we look at the circumstances surrounding Jesus. Some other sources outside of the Hebrew canon where you have belief in resurrection reported. You have 2nd Maccabees, 1st Enoch, Apocalypse of Baruch. So these are all things that would have been, these are writings that would have come before Christ. They're writings that everyone in Jesus' time would have been familiar with. But they didn't make it into the Hebrew canon as inspired text. But they're still significant in terms of letting us know what people believed at that time. So we set our Old Testament foundation here. And so now we look to the New Testament and its accounts of Jesus' resurrection. Something that's just important to kind of deal with at the outset is the question of, is the New Testament a reliable source? Part of the question, part of the origins of this question, I think, can kind of stem from the fact that, well, we know that this is a religious text. It's got elements of faith involved and stuff. And so some people kind of call into question the reliability of it on that basis. We also know it's very old. But the fact of the matter is when you compare the text of the New Testament against other ancient texts, the New Testament far and away has the most number of manuscripts and manuscripts that appear most closely from the times in which they were making a record of the things which occurred. So you look at the gap of time here. You have Tacitus's Annals, the earliest manuscript that you have from when the time that he was writing is 750 years later. It's like, how can you know that's actually reliable text, a record of what he actually wrote? Maybe some monk just was like, I'm going to pretend to be Tacitus tonight and just wrote up a history. But if you did that, if you're that critical about everything, then we really couldn't know anything about history. And it's okay to have a certain level of a limited amount of confidence on some of these things. And you'll hear historians saying, well, we think this is what happened. Part of the thing is, too, you see things like Caesar's Gallic Wars. Obviously, Caesar, really big political actor, wanted to make his exploits seem really glorious. And so he brings a certain bias to the table. And yet historians still depend on that, even though obviously Caesar has a bias to make everything seem great. Yeah, Kathleen?
Why does the number of manuscripts matter?
Because if you only have a small number of manuscripts, it's really tough to know whether that's an accurate representation of what the original text said. The more manuscripts that you have, it gives the greater opportunity for there to be conflicts. So if you have a large number of manuscripts and they're all saying the same thing, then that indicates to you that, okay, this is a reliable, the text has been preserved as it's gone down through the years. That's not to say there isn't any differences between the texts. You'll see some slight grammatical differences among the New Testament texts. You'll also see some sections, like you'll see at like the end of Mark 18, where I think it's verses 9 to 21. I can't remember what the last verse is in that chapter. But because of comparing manuscripts, they've seen that some of these verses don't appear in the earliest ones. And so some scholars are like, okay, we're not going to include that. But what's really significant is any of the discrepancies don't touch it. Any verses in the New Testament text that are really significant in terms of the things that they are reporting. Just to answer your question, yeah, that's why it's important. The more that you have a greater dispersion of the text, and you're able to figure out, okay, is this actually reliable? So when you're dealing with only like 36 texts, can't really have as much confidence, though people do assume some confidence because they rely on these records for piecing together human history. Now, I should kind of, I'll jump back a step, even though I just kind of gave it away. If I was going to ask you, what was the earliest, most reliable account of Jesus' resurrection, what would most of you think it would be? Where would it be found? Yeah, you would think one of the Gospels, maybe Mark. Like a lot of scholars think Mark was written early. Some think Matthew. You go to one of those. But actually, the earliest report that we have of Jesus' resurrection is found in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And lots of New Testament scholars, whether they're Christians or thorough skeptics, atheists, they all have a fair amount of confidence that Paul wrote the book of 1 Corinthians and is written in about 55 AD. And what's really interesting is that in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, he shares this little saying here, which has all the markings of an early creed. And you get this indicated right at the outset here. It says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." So Paul's like, I'm not making this up. This is what others gave to me. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, obviously, Paul added that last little bit there, but everything else here has all the markings of a sort of creed, like a summary that's been kind of issued for explaining the basic claims about Jesus, that he died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. And then it's really interesting. It says that he appeared to Cephas. And anyone know who Cephas is? Any guesses? Peter. It's Peter. It's the Aramaic name for Peter. You don't see Paul use this. So he's using Peter's Aramaic name because this is a sort of summary that he's actually received and that is commonly known. And then it's interesting too, you have this report of Jesus appearing to 500 brothers at one time. You don't find this anywhere else in the rest of Scripture. Now, the scholars, especially, you look at New Testament resurrection scholars, Michael Licona and Gary Habermas, and others as well, they look at this and they say, this is something that would have been brought together within like 3 years after Jesus' resurrection. So this is the earliest kind of summary of the faith that's actually put together. So you're looking like between like 33 AD, 35 AD, thereabouts. And so we ask, when did Paul receive this? Well, we actually have some clues as to when he received it. You go to Galatians 1, 5 through 19. It says here, down verse 18, that after 3 years he was in Arabia, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, so that name appears, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So both the two names that appear in that little summary that Paul gives come up here when he goes and visits them and talks about the faith, basically. So these are the ones that Paul receives this account from. He also, in Acts 9, this is after, Paul has been confronted by Christ on the road to Damascus, turned from a persecutor of the faith to a missionary of the faith. Barnabas brings him to the apostles, and he spends a lot of time with them, and he begins preaching. So you can assume during that time that they're sharing everything they know about Jesus. So he went in and out among them at Jerusalem. There's a little question of what, is Paul referring to that same visit that he did in Galatians? Is this a separate one? So it was either on one or two occasions that Paul was with them, and the core of the gospel, the core claims about Jesus' resurrection, were shared with him from the apostles. So what do the Gospels say? So we kind of just really broadly looked at the New Testament, specifically at Paul. But now we look at the Gospels, as that's where we see the resurrection explained in some greater detail. Well, if you look at all the Gospels, all of them record the resurrection occurring. You have different details recorded in each. Some of them include certain details, others exclude others of various persons and places, and kind of like a superficial reading of that. You see those differences and you say, are they contradicting? They're not contradicting. It's just the way in which they went about recording events during that time. Our expectation of reporting on things has been kind of set by like the New York Times standard, in which you like take every single detail. But for them, they wouldn't have felt compelled to have to include every single detail. And it's in that way that the Gospels really act as kind of complements to one another in the accounts that they're giving of the resurrection. And what's essential is that they all maintain that the resurrection occurred. It's clear in all of them that the tomb was empty. You have women as the first one, who are the first reporters, or first ones that encounter the empty tomb. And Jesus appears to both individuals and groups in all of them. There's a little caveat there with the Gospel of Mark, because again, that ending chapter is kind of cut short a little bit, but we'll look at that in a sec. So just to kind of turn to that, to see, Jesus encounters post-resurrection. We look in the Gospel of Matthew, and it says, "Behold, Jesus met them and said greetings." And it says when they saw him. So these are all things important to mark out, that this isn't just individual experiences. Now, it's significant in the case of Paul because he was persecuting the faith, and all of a sudden he does a 180. But that was admittedly an individual experience for him. But for the disciples, they're claiming that this is something that they all saw, that he met them, that they all saw him. This wasn't just like, oh, well, Peter saw him, and so we kind of went along with that. See, also in Mark, this is where you have it's kind of cut short. You're kind of left on a cliffhanger in Mark if you end the chapter here, where you have the women come, and it says they saw a young man sitting on the right side dressed in a white robe. This isn't Jesus, this is an angel. And they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen." So the tomb's empty. The angel's telling them that he's risen from the dead. All these women are witness of this angel. So they're all claiming that it wasn't just an individual experience. And he says, "See the place where they laid him," and that he's going before them to Galilee, where you'll see him. So Mark's anticipating that there's going to be more encounters with Jesus, even though he doesn't offer further recording of that, if you don't have confidence in the remaining verses in Mark 16. You go to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus goes to his disciples and he stands among them and says, "Peace to you." And they were freaked out and because they thought that he was a spirit. But then he quite explicitly proves to them that he's not a spirit. He says, "Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And then he says, "Do you have anything to eat?" And he eats food, eats broiled fish. And then after that, he leads them out. And you're like, "Let's go on the road." And he leads them out as far as Bethany. And then he sends to heaven. You see earlier in that chapter of Luke 24 also, this is on the road to Emmaus. He walked with these two disciples, Cleopas and then another disciple that wasn't named. He walks on the road with them. He's talking about the scriptures with them, why everything happened to Jesus had to happen, but they don't recognize Jesus for who he is until they sit at the table and suddenly their eyes are open. But you have two people who are having this experience. So lots of group experiences that are having here. It's not just isolated individual, "Oh yeah, I saw Jesus," saying we saw Jesus. Yeah.
Sorry, I was confused about, you said 1 Corinthians was the first report of the resurrection. Did I misunderstand that?
So in terms of, so that, I'm glad you actually brought that up. So when we're talking about like the New Testament texts, obviously chronologically in terms of how things are playing out, like the Gospels are earlier in what they're recording. And obviously 1 Corinthians is later in that timeline. But in terms of when the texts themselves were actually written, and if you kind of considered a creed, oral creed, to be kind of something that's been formulated, that formulation of that oral creed would have preceded the actual writing of the Gospels. And a lot of scholars would think that 1 Corinthians was actually written before some of these Gospels were. So when you're talking about like the Gospels, many scholars would allow that they were written before 100 AD. If you wanted to do, it's always debated back and forth, but kind of the nice kind of easy way to kind of test out how early one of these Gospels might be written is if you look at the book of Acts. The book of Acts doesn't report Paul's death. It would seem to be kind of an important thing to record if it happened in the time in which the book of Acts was written. The author of Acts, Luke, does not do that. It says that it's indicated that Paul was killed in Rome around like 66 AD. So you say Acts was written before 66 AD. What comes before the book of Acts is the Gospel of Luke. Luke is really explicit. Acts is kind of like part 2. So that would indicate that the Gospel of Luke is written earlier than that. So again, lots of indications that we have really early reports that are being put together. But if you're going to be like really stingy, like, okay, what's the earliest like reports that we have of the resurrection? That oral creed is really early that Paul is sharing, indicating that this is an early belief among the apostles. It's not just something like, okay, like 50 years on, they're like, oh yeah, like Jesus actually rose from the dead, as though it was something that legendary that just kind of grew up over time. It's significant that kind of right at the outset they believed that he was bodily raised from the dead rather than them coming up with that belief like 70 years later. Yeah. And something also just, thinking about the book of Acts, you have Jesus, the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus also occurring in the first chapter of Acts. It says that Jesus presented himself alive to them after suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. Like sometimes I think we forget about that. Like we think, okay, Jesus rose from the dead, maybe he appeared to a couple of them and then he ascended to heaven. But he was around for 40 days. And Luke's saying that he was speaking to them, teaching them about the kingdom of God. So clearly what's being claimed here is more than just like, yeah, like I had this crazy vision and Jesus was here. Like there's something much more thoroughgoing, almost thorough, but just also really more common, even though obviously Jesus is much different because he can kind of come and goes as he please, but he also can eat food and he just sits and talks with them. So yeah, we go to the Gospel of John. We see more of the same of how he came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then turning to the disciple Thomas, again, like very explicitly trying to prove like I'm actually here. Put your finger here in my hand. Put out your hand. Place it in my side. So actively trying to prove to Thomas, like, this isn't just a vision. I'm not just a spirit. I'm actually raised from the dead. And again, more eating later on when Peter and some of the other disciples are on the Sea of Galilee and Jesus is on the shore. They invite him over. They have fish for breakfast. And John here records this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So as I was saying earlier about the Gospels, all written before 100 AD, other reasons why we have to trust them other than just the fact that they're written at their early date is that you have geographical and cultural details reported in them that only someone on the ground could know. So like 200 years on, you have these other fake gospels that come up. They're called Gnostic gospels. So you have like the Gospel of Thomas and like Acts of this, Gospel of that. I think the History Channel made a whole thing of like, ooh, these like uncovered gospels. They're gospels that were made up 200 years later. And what's really interesting is that they're full of fantastical details, but lack all the geographical markings of someone who is actually familiar with the area. So you have like someone writing in Egypt who hasn't lived in Palestine and known the land or known the culture. Something that's really interesting is like all the names that are used in the Gospels are accurate reflections of the names that were common at that time in the land. Another thing that's significant, like you think about just the fact that they refer to Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth. Why do they do that? Anyone have an idea? Jesus.
Is it a dig because Nazareth didn't have a good reputation?
That's part of it, but that's not the only reason. The reason why they call him Jesus of Nazareth is because there's lots of Jesuses. Like, it's basically functioning as their last name. It'd be like, oh yeah, I saw Tom doing this, or Jimmy, or Mike. Like everyone knows a bunch of Mikes. You have to have some kind of, and we have last names in our culture. They didn't have last names. They might have said, son of so and so. That would function as a name, or where they were from. In the case of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. And if someone was just concocting that later on, they wouldn't have done that. They would have just said like, well, everyone knows Jesus. Why would I have to say Jesus of Nazareth? Or you're talking about Peter, or James and John, the sons of Zebedee. There's just, they accurately reflect the names that are being used on the ground. They accurately reflect other details, things about like Pontius Pilate and things that you just couldn't concoct on your own. What's also really interesting is you have undesigned corroboration of each other's accounts. And I couldn't possibly go through all the examples, but I'll show you one of my favorite examples of this. So when Jesus feeds the 5,000, when he's in the area of Galilee, in John's gospel, it says that he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now, I don't know about you, but it's like, why is Jesus asking Philip? I mean, like this is like the only appearance of Philip in the gospel here, and I mean, other than him just being named elsewhere, and I'd be kind of, if I was Philip, I'd be like, gee whiz, like this is my only appearance here. You couldn't do better. And so if you were just kind of making this up, when you have like Jesus asking Peter, asking John, why ask Philip? Well, when we look at the other Gospels, and when we look at earlier in the Gospel of John, the details all come together. In Luke's Gospel, in his recording of the feeding of the 5,000, he says, on their return, the apostles told them all that they had done. He took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. And then all this feeding of the 5,000 took occurred. Okay, so you have Jesus saying to Philip, where are we to buy bread so these people may eat? They're near Bethsaida. Question remains, why ask Philip? Well, if you go earlier in the Gospel of John, it says, now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So that's just one example of the undesigned kind of corroboration. It's not like there's some conspiracy here. It's just kind of coincidentally, Luke mentioned about Bethsaida. John mentioned that Philip was in Bethsaida, but he wasn't mentioning anything about Bethsaida here. He just referenced Philip.
Philip knew.
Yes, exactly. Philip knew. He knew where to get food from. So the technical term for this is called undesigned coincidences. So if you want to Google that sometime, you'll find all kinds of stuff on this, specifically by the scholar Tim McGrew. It's written exactly as it sounds, Tim McGrew. So yeah, really, really interesting. But another indication that the Gospels are trustworthy accounts. You also have just kind of unusual details, embarrassing details in the Gospels. I mean, some of the unusual things is just how stupid the disciples look a lot of the time. If you were just making this all up, why wouldn't you make yourself look better? Really? I mean, Peter again and again is shown to have a lack of faith. He denies Jesus. He cuts a guy's ear off when he's not supposed to do that. And then you even look at the names of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, these Gnostic gospels, these made up gospels later on use lots of prominent names. But I mean, think about the names of the gospels. You've got Matthew and John. Those are both, members of the 12. You would say Matthew, I mean, he's not like a big name. You would think like maybe you'd have the gospel of Peter, but okay, we'll allow Matthew. But then you have Mark and Luke. Like, who are these guys? If you were just making this up, why would you have, one of the gospels being named after this guy, Mark? Mark was an associate of Peter. And so he was reporting things that Peter wrote. But why wouldn't you just go right for just calling it Peter rather than the gospel of Mark? And in the case of Luke, Luke is a physician. He hung out a lot with Paul. He had access to a lot of these witnesses. But again, it's just another indication that this isn't, if you were just kind of concocting all this up, you wouldn't do these kind of things. The other thing, as far as the resurrection goes, is you wouldn't make women the first reporters. Now, this is not a reflection of my point of view, but in the ancient times, women were not considered reliable witnesses. Look at someone like Josephus, who was a Jewish historian of that time. This is what he has to say about women. He says, "But let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at least. And those such whose testimony is confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be omitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." So with that in mind, knowing like the great intellects of your society say, basically the testimony of women is worthless, as the writers of the Gospels, why would you make kind of your primary first witnesses women? Wouldn't make sense to do that. Instead, it would make sense if you said, "Oh yeah, Peter and John went to the tomb first, and they found it empty, and they talked to the angels, and they saw Jesus," rather than these women. It's just another mark, kind of indicating the authenticity of these accounts. Now, to kind of go outside of the New Testament, we do find just some really basic accounts from some non-Christian sources that corroborate some of the gospel details. So looking at this guy, Josephus, he lived between 37 and 100 AD. He writes a little bit about Jesus. Now, there are some things that, this is supposed to be the most kind of conservative, that is kind of most modest account of what he's written on this, because there's other things, but scholars think that Christians might have added some things later on. So, but there's a great deal of confidence that this is something that Josephus actually wrote. It says, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." So even if you cut out the part about the resurrection stuff, you do have some basic... Josephus is aware of the existence of Jesus and this whole movement that's going on. You also have the historian Tacitus, who was alive during the time of the reign of Nero, which was like in the 60s AD. Nero was responsible for killing Paul and Peter. Paul was beheaded. Peter is reported to have been crucified. And then he burned a bunch of Christians on posts and did all kinds of miserable things to Christians. But he says, consequently, to get rid of the report that Nero burned Rome, because that's what was going on, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So Tacitus is definitely no friend of Christians here. He's more of the opinion of like good riddance. They're a bunch of troublemakers. But you see how he's reporting on the reality that Jesus existed. These things actually happened. And I didn't mention this, but it's beyond a doubt that Jesus is an actual historical person who existed. No serious scholar questions that. The resurrection is debated, but the actual historical reality of Jesus is not questioned. And anyone who debates that really isn't to be taken seriously. So looking, kind of swiveling over to, okay, what are the facts that are kind of widely accepted? These all come from Gary Habermas, his book, The Risen Jesus and Future Hope. He reports these as facts that are widely accepted by scholars. And he's basing this off of his study of scholars from Germany, France, English. Those are the texts that he's able to engage with. It's not including texts outside of those languages and traditions. But this is widely accepted. So more than 50%, you would say. So it's accepted that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that he was buried most likely in a private tomb. So thinking about how Jesus was taken by Joseph of Arimathea and buried in his tomb. Soon afterward, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. The disciples had experiences that they believed were actual experiences of the risen Jesus. And due to these experiences, the disciples were thoroughly transformed, being willing to die for this belief. The proclamation for the resurrection took place very early at the beginning of church history, so that's kind of referring to that 1 Corinthians text. The disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place, I have some typos in here, in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. And the gospel message centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus. Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worship. Why is that significant? Because Jesus rose on the third day on the Sunday. So right at the outset, that's kind of indicating, wow, these Christians are really making a lot of Sunday. Why they switch from worshiping on the Sabbath day, Saturday, to Sunday? There must be a reason for that. James, the brother of Jesus, and a former skeptic, was converted when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. And just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So all these things, it's like, you don't see here that most scholars widely accept that Jesus rose from the dead. These are all just like really basic facts of what occurred. Of what seemed to occur. Now, you can whittle this down to kind of like the most essential facts that are accepted by a higher percentage. And by doing that, you get it down to, I don't know why I did it that way, but these 6 facts. That Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And we'll be engaging with some of these things in a little bit more detail when we look at the alternate theories. The fact that the disciples had some kind of experience. There's no scholar that would dispute that they had some kind of real experience, because otherwise, if they didn't have these experiences, where does Christianity come from? Something had to have happened for this to all come about. Such that they were thoroughly transformed, even being willing to die for this belief. And then that this proclamation of the resurrection began early. It wasn't like 100 years later they started talking about this. They did this right from the outset. Again, the same thing about James and about Saul. Now, I want to point out, because maybe some of this is new to you, thinking about Jesus having a brother, James, and him not believing in him. But we see this appear in the Gospels. You look at the Gospel of Matthew, and it reports that Jesus had brothers. In Matthew 13:55, it says, are not his brothers James, Joseph, and Simon, and Judas? This seems to also be another report of them as well, because you have Mary, the mother of James and Joseph there. You have them calling on him. while he's about his ministry. But most significantly, you have here in the Gospel of John, John 7, 3-5, his brothers speaking to him. They say to him, "Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. So if you consider that, and I mean, you can almost be sympathetic to them. Like, I mean, imagine if one of your siblings claimed to be the Messiah. It might take a little bit of convincing, maybe be impossible because your sibling's not perfectly righteous like Jesus, but you can understand some of their skepticism, and you have to ask, well, what would change? How would that change after your brother gets himself crucified? Like, if anything, you'd be like, see, like, I knew it. Like, he got himself into all this trouble, brought the shame on our family, all of that. So why would you go from not believing him when things are actually going kind of okay for him? And then he gets crucified, and then all of a sudden, your tune changes. Doesn't make sense. Unless James actually encountered his brother raised from the dead. And this will come up in just a bit too, but I think it's also just notable. You just think about how the disciples were so radically transformed and willing to suffer for the faith, and how that's radically different than before Jesus' death on the cross. You think Judas betrayed him. Now, Judas died, but it just demonstrates that one of his disciples was willing to betray him. And then you have Peter willing to deny him. And then all the rest, except for it seems like John kind of falls around and he's at the cross, so that Jesus says to John, here's your mother, Mary, here's your son. John stuck around, but all the others scattered. But after the fact, once Jesus is raised from the dead, they're all faithful. Peter's no longer scared. Why does that happen? Why don't we see any of them defect? So we boil it down to these 5 facts here that are widely accepted. And so the question is what best accounts for these facts? Now we have some alternative theories, and we're going to go through these. So the first alternative theory is that Jesus didn't really die. It's called the swoon theory. It's a pretty old theory. And it's actually, it continues to be relevant because in the Quran, it's reported that Jesus didn't actually die. Now, I think there's kind of varying theories on that either he escaped some of it, or it just seemed that he died, or that he switched someone else to be on the cross instead of him. But there's nothing that would indicate that that's what actually happened. And so if you think about Jesus on the cross, suffering crucifixion, we have to ask, is it possible for him to actually survive that whole ordeal? Now, I want to ask you a question. How do you think crucifixion kills somebody? It is slow.
It would, but not God. Strangulation.
Okay, kind of barking up the. Okay, yeah, that's part of it. That's kind of one of the things. It's actually heart attack. Before all this, Jesus is flogged, tons of blood loss. So he's probably hypovolemic. He's losing lots of blood. That's why he's struggling to carry the cross. So he's dealing with all that. But when you're on the cross, you either nail your hands, and they'd actually nail you through the wrist because the hand can't support the body's weight. So they put it through the hand and then through the ankles, or they would tie you. Because you don't really need the nails to finish the job. It's kind of one of those funny things, like you think you really need the nails, you don't. Because what's going on is, as you're hanging in that position, your lungs are being trapped in this kind of exhale position. And so in order to breathe, you've got to push up. And if you got to keep doing that just to breathe, eventually you're going to get exhausted, and carbon dioxide builds up in your bloodstream, and that's what causes the heart attack. And it causes a fluid buildup of water around the heart. And so this is what accounts for when they stabbed Jesus in the side. Remember to know that both blood and water come out, because this is what Jesus has suffered. So it has all the markings that Jesus has died. He's actually died. And aside from that, I mean, these Roman soldiers, they're not doctors, but they're expert killers. And they'd be in big trouble if the people that they were supposed to execute did not actually end up dead. If that happened, they'd probably end up dead. In any case, they would be in really big trouble. And so if they checked him out and they said he's dead, he's dead. But besides that, like let's say like somehow he managed to survive. They carry him to this tomb. They put this big rock in front of it. How's the guy get out? If you were in that condition, you've been scourged, you're worn out, how do you move that rock? If you managed to, and you somehow got to your disciples, you would not be an inspiring figure. Or if they came along and helped you out, they wouldn't be inspired. They'd be like, okay, how about we not do this anymore? How about we go underground? So it's just a really implausible explanation for Jesus somehow being alive. This is actually the whole medical explanation. I just explained it, paraphrased it, but this is from Dr. Kathleen Schreier, the associate professor of the Department of Biology and Chemistry at Azusa Pacific University. The fluid around the heart, it's called a pericardial effusion. So that leads us to the next theory, that the body was stolen. Now, that theory immediately leads you to the question, by who? The authorities wouldn't have had any motive to steal the body. They want this guy dead. They don't want him causing any more trouble. They want him to stay where he is. If the disciples are the one that stole it, then they would know that they made this up. And so they'd be knowingly lying. We would have to deal with that. If someone that was associated with them stole the body, or even someone unassociated and they just didn't know, then you'd have to say, okay, you don't have a body, but you still have to account for the experiences that they had. And so you'd have to go to some kind of like hallucination theory. So all this to say, just saying like, okay, the body was stolen, it's not like that. That's not a sufficient explanation of things. You have to deal with other things as well.
And there
Yeah.
was soldiers posted outside.
Yes. Yeah. It's in the Matthew's gospel reports how soldiers were set outside. It's debated whether it was Jewish guards or Roman guards. I think at least one scholar I was listening to was suggesting it was Roman guards. And Matthew records that basically they were paid off to say that the body was stolen. But you've got to deal with the fact that you've got these guards set out. You've got to overcome them too. Now that's all possible. It's possible. But even if you posit that the body was stolen, you then have to account for what the disciples do next. So there's just them putting him in the tomb, but just kind of the idea of them stealing the body. So let's look at this idea about hallucination. Kind of at the forefront, you kind of think like, well, maybe this theory has something going for it. Because you could imagine that maybe the disciples, kind of in the state that they were in, might have some kind of hallucination about Jesus. But there's some problems with this, one of which is even while Jesus was telling them that he was going to die and that he was going to be raised from the dead, They didn't seem to believe him. And you go back to the earlier texts about resurrection in the Old Testament. None of them talk about there being a resurrection in the middle of history. There's just one resurrection, and it's everybody. They weren't anticipating that someone would be the Messiah, come and die, and then be raised from the dead. This is why, we talk about those resurrection appearances afterwards. Jesus is sitting down and teaching them, helping them understand everything, because they weren't really expecting this. But what's most critically important when we think about the hallucination theory is that what's most troublesome for it is that hallucinations are individual experiences. They're subjective experiences. I can have a hallucination, but you cannot have my hallucination. You'd have to have your own hallucination. And how would all of our hallucinations match up and have the same details? And you'll remember from all the gospel texts that we went through, they all recorded how he appeared before them all, and he ate food with us, and he let us touch his wounds, and we all saw this. The only other thing you could go and say from there is, well, maybe some of them had a hallucination and they tried to convince the others, like, oh yeah, there he is, don't you see him? You could try to do something like that, but that just creates some more problems. Now, something to kind of just note too, I think here, is that the disciples were aware of the possibility of different possibilities than Jesus being raised from the dead. In Matthew 14:26, when they're out in the Sea of Galilee and Jesus is out walking to them, their first idea is that it's a ghost. It says the same thing in the Mark 6:49. So they're aware of that being a possible explanation for the things that they're seeing. And you'll remember in that text from Luke 24, when Jesus first appeared to them, they thought that they saw a spirit. And they could have just gone with that. They could have just, okay, we've been visited by the Spirit of Jesus. And all of that would have made more sense than going on to claim that he was actually raised from the dead. So I think sometimes we think that the disciples must have been just really simple folk and stuff, but they were aware of like a lot of different possibilities, and none of them expected this to happen. There's other problems as well, and kind of getting back to this idea of whether they just had some experiences and altered them and all of this. And I just want to read this in full because it's really great. It's by this guy, Zachary Breitenbach, and he wrote this journal article. It's called "A New Argument That Collective Hallucinations Do Not Adequately Account for the Group Appearances of Jesus in the Gospels." You can Google that, and you'll find this article. He says the first possibility is that the disciples themselves originally altered their appearance accounts to achieve these apologetic goals. However, this explanation undermines their sincere belief in the resurrection appearances. Adopting this option forfeits the value that the collective hallucination hypothesis is meant to preserve by denying the well-accepted fact that the disciples truly believed that they saw Jesus and reported what they saw. If the disciples had a hallucinatory experience of Jesus, but sincerely believe that he actually appeared to them, then they would not alter this account to promote a type of appearance that is different from what they experience. This would be intentional deception on their part. Moreover, it would be an odd deception for them to create given its un-Jewish nature, i.e. a dying Messiah who rises to an immortal existence before the end of the world. So what he's talking about there is the notion that first they had a hallucination that didn't feature them touching him eating, and them just changing that later on. The question is, why would they do that? Why would they start lying about that? Doesn't make sense. And then the other possibility that the church and not the disciples invented these themes later on to serve their purposes is equally problematic. If the Christian community modified the appearance accounts in order to uphold the belief in a dying and rising Messiah who rises to a bodily and immortal existence before the end of the world, then this raises a host of difficulties. Most crucially, one must ask, from where did these ideas originally come from? This option eliminates the possibility that it came from the original teaching of the disciples, and it certainly did not come from Judaism. Also, this option entails that the church is willing to depart dramatically from the appearance traditions that the disciples, the core witnesses to the most central beliefs of the church, originally taught. Why would the church do this? Also, why would they alter the traditions in this direction, promoting ideas that would be hard for Jews to accept and making it more difficult to convert Jews to Christianity? Not only did that make it difficult for Jews to come to Christianity, it made it difficult for Gentiles. You go to Paul's testimony. Paul testifies about the gospel in Athens before all the philosophers on Mars Hill. And they hear him out, they like what he's saying, and then he gets to the resurrection and they say, like that's crazy talk. Doesn't make sense why you would add that on later, because it was a stumbling block for a lot of people. The cross was a stumbling block for a lot of people as well. So it just doesn't make sense why the church would just change things up all of a sudden. So you kind of have two things. It's just one, as far as psychologically speaking, hallucinations, they're not group experiences. They're individual experiences. And then if you try to say, okay, some of them had hallucinations and they convinced everyone to go along, it's difficult to account for the things about the eating. It's also difficult to wrap your mind around some of them not actually seeing Jesus, but willing to suffer for these claims, even though they didn't experience seeing him themselves. I mean, you think about Thomas, he was a doubter. Like, why did he change? It says that he changed because he actually touched him. It took that much for him to actually believe in Jesus. Which this kind of leads us to the last option here, which is that just the disciples made it all up. And when it comes to lying, there's three different possible motivations for this. And this comes from this book called Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. He's a former detective, and so he kind of approaches, bringing together evidence in the way that you make a case, a criminal case. And he says these are the three primary motivations that I always saw in criminal cases: is either sex involved, money, greed, or a desire for power. When we think about the disciples, these sort of motivations don't add up. First of all, you think about what they suffered. A number of them died for the faith. It's disputed, how many of them did, because some of these are legendary accounts, but we know that we have a great amount of confidence that Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of John, died for the faith. And aside from that, they all suffered for it. So it's, would dying and suffering like that, would that really be worth it all for any amount of sex, money, or power? And the thing is when we go through these, we don't see any of them really appear in any records that we have about the apostles or the early church. As far as sex goes, you don't see Paul in his letter saying like, oh yeah, like give all the babes to me. We're all familiar with the stories about cult leaders. What do we see in cults in America? You have this leader rise up and he says, yeah, all the women should belong to me, basically. You don't see that with the apostles. You don't see them saying, oh yeah, you're supposed to give all this money to us as well. Paul says, I have a right to ask for you to support me, but I'm actually going to support myself by being a tent maker, literally making tents. He was collecting money, but it was for charity for those that were poor in Jerusalem. It's really interesting. You go to, I think it's Acts 3, and you have Peter and John going to the Temple Mount, and there's a lame man there who asks to be healed. He asks them for money, and they basically say, we don't have silver to give you, but we'll give you what we have. And they heal the guy. So you can tell, these aren't rich guys, and they weren't making money from this. And as far as power goes, it goes without saying, really, that they didn't have any real power early on. And, it didn't look, this is a picture of a pope. It wasn't like that for them. You don't get that kind of thing really until 300 years after, when Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. And hindsight 2020, maybe some of us could think, well, yeah, if I would become an iconic religious figure, maybe I would go through all that. But none of them had any assurances that was going to happen. For all they knew, they would just be forgotten. I mean, they were just no-name men from backwoods Israel. They didn't know that they'd be the most famous people probably in all of human history, apart from Jesus himself. So none of these motivations are really satisfactory to explain why they would lie. Instead, we see that they're utterly transformed. They go from being scared to being fearless. And they're quite explicit. They say, because we've seen the risen Christ. And one of the stipulations when they have to replace Judas for one of the 12, one of the stipulations is this is a guy that has to have been around and can testify to the resurrection. And Paul is included in that number of the apostles because he was visited by Christ. If Paul was just like a guy who converted to Christianity, he wouldn't have been an apostle. It's because he was someone who saw Christ, and that's what kind of certified them as apostles. They saw Christ. Now, I thought this was kind of an interesting observation. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Chuck Colson, but he was an aide for Richard Nixon, who's known as Nixon's hatchet man. And this is what he has to say about being loyal to people. He says Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. But one of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks. Then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is that all that those around the president were facing was an embarrassment, maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. And we see people that have all, like Chuck Colson, you can try it, that would be loyal under a lot of circumstances, but they all cracked. And yet the disciples didn't. And they didn't really have any motivation for that loyalty unless they actually encountered Jesus and had the assurance that they too would be raised from the dead just as he was. So if Jesus rose from the dead, then we have reasons to believe his claims about his identity and his ability to save humanity. It's a confirmation of everything that he did. Sometimes we kind of miss this, like what the authorities were doing and judging Jesus and executing him was basically saying, you're a liar. You're claiming to be God and you're not. You're claiming to be king. You're just a usurper. Jesus' resurrection turns over all of that and says, I overrule you. God overrules you. I am the king. I am God in the flesh. So it affirms everything Jesus says about himself and indicates that he has the authority to and the ability to save humanity. If he's raised from the dead, then we have reason to have confidence in the rest of the Bible, since it was proven correct in this case. And I think this is really important because a lot of us, I think, enjoy studying Scripture, and sometimes we come across parts of Scripture where we have a really tough time wrapping our minds around it. And sometimes we can feel like when we come against those tough spots that, like, if we can't overcome this, then our whole faith is going to fall apart. Like, I've come up against those things even in my own study of Scripture. And I think that weighs more heavily when we don't have the resurrection as our cornerstone. If you believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead and everything that he said about himself is true, then you can deal with your questions. You can deal with not knowing all the answers, as long as that remains true. we have reasonable hope that death can be overcome, which is significant. It's significant for us personally. It's also significant, I think, for our world, because our world is very afraid of death, and we're putting a lot of our hope into medical advances and staving off death. And if the Christian message is just we escape from this world, we escape from material existence, then that's not offering much hope. Jesus is offering something quite different, even though Christians can kind of stray into that sort of messaging. He's saying, no, like our bodies can be salvaged, they can be restored, and in fact, there will be a new creation where everything is made new. And I think very significantly, the history of our world and our personal stories are reframed. As far as the history of the world goes, it totally changes who we count as winners and losers. If Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then people like Alexander the Great and Napoleon and like all these other great, power mongering people, like they're the winners. They had all the toys at the end, kind of thing. And all the rest of us are losers. Jesus rose from the dead, though. Those people aren't the winners, unless they turn to Christ at the last second. But even so, like those who are winners are those who are following Christ, or following his footsteps. And it reframes our own personal stories too, I think, in terms of what is our lives really about? Is it about accumulating, or can we lay our lives down freely because we know that our life is secure because Christ has been raised and we will be raised too? So it changes everything about our understanding of the world, understanding about ourselves. And so we have a decision to make about Jesus, if we believe that he rose from the dead. And I think Jesus puts it best. I love this stained glass window. This is a stained glass window from our church. And at the bottom of it, it says this first part of this passage from John 11:25 through 26. It says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? That's the question that all of us have to answer. And if we believe in him, if we trust in him, then we will share in his resurrection life.